Hello. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on today's lecture. So today's topic of presentation is really fascinating for me because of my research grant that I got recently. And it's my great honor to introduce today's guest, Jeffry Simpson, who is a distinguished university teaching professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota, where he directs a doctoral minor in interpersonal relationships. And his research interests are really, really fascinating for me. So I'm really looking forward to today's meeting. And he focuses on adult attachment processes, trust, human mating, social influence, and he also examines how early developmental experiences are related to our adult health and various relationship outcomes. And he has been the editor of Personal Relationships and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the interpersonal relations and group processes. And most recently, he has served as a president of the International Association for Relationship Research. And he also did us a wonderful, great honor of joining our team in my grant focused on longitudinal development of couples. So I would like to welcome you to today's lecture. Hello, Jeff.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I believe, yes, we can hear you, we can see you. So I believe there's nothing else to add from me. You are all most welcome to read Professor Simpson's papers. They are really great and they show like the massive work he did in the longitudinal area of psychology. So I really invite you to do that. So today's lecture's topic is the early life attachment, stress and caregiving as predictors of adult health, a longitudinal view. So Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that really gracious, excuse me, certainly morning I just got up. That really gracious introduction. I really do appreciate it. And it's been a delight working with you and your group as you've started this really important and impressive grant project on the transition to parenthood. So I just want to thank you for that as well. I think I've got access to the screen. What I'm going to talk about today is a series of studies that we've done with a unique sample of people, part of the Minnesota Longitudinal Sample of Risk and Adaptation, and talk a little bit about what we've learned about what happens to people early in life, for good or for ill, is related to their health outcomes, their physical health outcomes, usually in the early 30s to late 30s, basically. We have data on that. We've been following this sample from before they were born, not me, with the royal we, until now they're about in their mid 40s. And so we have a lot of information on what happened to them across their entire lives. And so I'm excited to talk about this and give you kind of an overview of basically what we have found. Let's see, how do I advance the slide here? There we go, I see it, okay. So the goal of the talk is a real simple one. To address the question, are certain interpersonal events experienced early in life prospectively related to adult health outcomes many years later? And we'll look at it from different kinds of angles that we have. And I'll be talking about the results of 5 published papers, and they're all listed at the back of the talk in case you want to know exactly what they are, if you ever want to read them. 5 papers that we've done that kind of illuminate what we've been finding with this sample. So I'm not sure how well you can see this. This is the best rendition I could create of this figure, but one kind of general way to think about our approach is a social developmental model of health that Greg Miller and Edith Chin developed about 10 years ago. And they've done a lot of work looking at health from the vantage point of childhood socioeconomic disadvantage. And our sample, the Minnesota sample, was born below the poverty line in terms of income to first-time mothers, many of whom were, either chronically poor or were temporarily poor, given that they were having a child and they didn't always have a stable romantic partner with them. So Miller and Chin, what they argue here is that childhood socioeconomic disadvantage um, exposes children to sensitive kinds of things, family instability, oftentimes, low nurturance, conflict and violence in the family and around the family, poor nutrition, toxic exposure to lead, and things like that when you're living in an environment where you don't have really good housing. And exposure to these things early in life has programming effects on the body. It programs you to be prepared for a lot of pathogens in your environment, exposure to things that are going to really require your immune system to ramp up and your body to be, quote, vigilant to external pathogens and attacks and things like that. And so what these early exposures do is they program your body in the first 3 to 5 years of life to either ramp up and have a pro-inflammatory phenotype where your response to pathogens and infections and things like that is aggressive. Your resistance to shutting down inflammation is limited because the body's being programmed for an environment that's going to be very, very toxic to it. And you get chronic mild inflammation. And this inflammation, this pro-inflammatory phenotype, is oftentimes then reinforced by what are called accentuating effects. So as you age, and you're still in an environment probably where there's instability, there's low nurturance, it's a tough, rough and tumble environment, you become vigilant to threat. You become more likely to have difficulties with other people and other things in life. You seek rewards immediately. You grab what you can when you can, as opposed to delaying gratification. You don't have as much self-control as other people do. And you may live a less healthy lifestyle. You may not only eat poorly, but you might drink more, or you might ingest non-prescribed medications or drugs. And so basically this pro-inflammatory phenotype across time, with the body kind of hyper-regulated, impairs your health across time, across many, many, many years. And there are other things besides what I've talked about here that are also involved. Obviously, genes are involved and further environmental exposures are involved, but we're going to focus mainly on what's on the upper left-hand side of the model and what I'll be talking about here in the next few minutes. So this is kind of a general way to think across the lifespan about what can lead to a pro-inflammatory situation that can then maybe downstream 10, 20, 30 years later have negative health implications. So the Minnesota Longitudinal Study of Risk and Adaptation is a sample of 170 approximately currently involved and enrolled people who were children at the time, of course, when they were born. And they were born to first-time mothers who were below the poverty line getting free medical help in Minneapolis in 1975 or 1976. There are a lot of measures in the sample that are really relevant to addressing the Miller and Jen model. And I was not, when this study started, I was in high school. Okay, so I wasn't involved with it, but I become involved as a co-PI since being at Minnesota. And because I've got a strong interest in attachment and interpersonal processes in particular, this is a great situation for me because they have a lot of the measures that I am interested in and I care about. So I've been working with my students over the last 10 or so years to try to answer some of these questions. So some of the measures that we have in the sample are when our targets were 12 months old, a year old, and 18 months old, they engaged in the strain situation procedure with their primary caregiver, usually their mother. The strain situation is a 20-minute lab situation that involves separations and reunions between the infant and their primary caregiver. And what's coded for basically is the reaction of the infant when the mother returns to the room. These situations are strange and scary if you're a young child. You don't know where your mother is gone or if she's going to come back or when she's going to come back. And the reunion is very diagnostic. So securely attached kids, when they're stressed, but their mother comes back into the room after being gone, they use her typically as a source of support. They're upset when she comes in, but she soothes them, they calm down, and they resume exploration and play in the room fairly quickly. And about 60% of kids in most cultures tend to be classified as secure in the strange situation. Insecure kids typically do one of two things. Either they can't be calmed down when their mother comes back and they're angry and they never resume play, or they tend to kind of ignore their mother and not use her as a source of comfort and calming and soothing. And they kind of are in the room, but they never resume play because they're still distracted by what's happened. And about 40% of children are insecure, and there's different types of insecurity. So we have that early on, which is great. We also have really good measures of how much stress they were exposed to at different points in life. For the first 17 years, the stress was assessed by interviewing the birth mothers, the mothers of each of these children, about what was going on in their life. And interviewers asked about how disruptive each of about 40 different stressful things, potential things, were. And so we have good information on maternal stress. And we did this because obviously children can't answer interviews. They may not be able to tell you exactly what's going on. And so the idea is that the stress the mother is experiencing probably is going to seep down and affect the child. From 18 years old on, when they were of consenting age, we then did these exact same life stress interviews with the exact same procedure and the exact same questions on the targets themselves, the children who were adolescents going into adulthood. And so we got really good measures of life stress and how disruptive these different events were to the mothers and then their children when the children became 18 and of consenting age. We also have really good videotaped recordings of how their primary caretaker, typically their mother, responded to them in stressful and challenging tasks, starting early on at 3 months when they were upset and being fed, and continuing until they were 13, where they were asked to try to resolve a current problem as a young adolescent with their primary caregiver. And I think there were 5 different periods where we got videos, we recorded them, we had coders come in and code for what we termed maternal sensitivity, the degree to which the mother was able to deal with her distressed child in a way that was productive, that allowed the child to understand what was going on given their cognitive ability, and that they could then complete the task as best that they were doing as best as they could. It's very unusual, by the way, for any longitudinal sample to have video recordings of what people look like while they were distressed as children interacting with their parents. I'll talk a little bit about that measure later. And then we have health measures. We've had them basically all the way from the time they were adolescents on. But what I'm going to focus on today is the assessments that we took when our target participants, our 170 people, were 32 years old and were 37 years old. And so we have good information on the quality of their health reported by the targets, and also the number of diagnosed health problems that they have diagnosed by medical professionals. And we also have an index called the Cardiometabolic Functioning Index, which is a combination of 4 markers of health. Each participant's BMI, their waist to hip ratio, their blood pressure taken at several points in time, and also C-reactive protein, the amount of inflammation that's appearing in their blood at the time of assessment. And these 4 measures are correlated positively. So if you are more likely to have a higher BMI, larger waist relative to your hips, higher blood pressure, and more inflammation in your blood, all those things go together to form a higher cardiometabolic score. Okay, so I'll be talking about some of these measures in the next couple of minutes as we kind of go through these studies. If you have questions along the way, just drop them into the chat and I'll try my best to answer them, but we'll also have some time at the very end here. Okay, so our first question was a very simple one back in 2013. Does being securely attached in the strange situation when you're 12 and 18 months old, because we have 2 assessments, predict health outcomes 30 years later? So think about this for a second. We're looking at a 20-minute observer-rated interaction And we're correlating that basically with something, the health outcome 30 years later. A lot happens in between. And so this prediction is a very logical one from attachment theory and also from the Miller and Chen model, but it's a kind of a risky prediction. 30 years is a long time, right? What did we find? We found that participants, Ps, who were insecure as children, rated in a strange situation, reported more health problems when they were 32 years old. And these are health problems that were diagnosed by medical professionals, not just kind of your typical complaining about, having colds and stuff like that. And then you can see the point by serial correlation there. It's not huge, but it is significant, -24. What we also do in our studies, though, is we want to try to pin down the effects to see if they may be limited to the developmental period that we're interested in, which in this case is attachment in about the first year of life. So we then did analyses where we statistically controlled for a bunch of confounds to see if we could break down this correlation of -24, render it insignificant. So we partialed out gender, and the correlation held. We then partialed out a bunch of age 32 confounds or potential confounds that we know are correlated with how healthy you are. So we partialed out how their SES, the target's SES or participants' SES when they were 32, the correlation held. We partialed out their BMI, their level of trait neuroticism. Neuroticism correlates with reporting or having health problems. The amount of life stress at age 32, and how much support they thought they had in their network from friends and family at 32. And when we could control for all of these things, the effect still held. So this suggested to us that it's something about that early relationship with your caretaker when you're distressed and the degree to which you feel you can turn to them for support and scaffolding. It's a developmental term, scaffolding, that may be relevant in kind of setting people up for health problems later on in life. That was the first study. It appeared in Health Psychology in 2013. We then started to step back, though, and think a little bit about, okay, so attachment theory, what makes a person secure or insecure? There are many things that probably contribute to it, but one of the things that's been talked about a lot and it's been documented empirically is that secure individuals, not only kids, but also adults, tend to be secure because they have caregivers or attachment figures who provide good care. And of course, we have videotapes of the quality of care that our participants got from their birth mothers, their primary caretakers when they were young. And so the next question that we had, which we addressed in a paper that came out in Psychological Science in 2015, is how is the quality of care that you get when you're young, when you're a child, in the first primarily 5 to 10 years, how is it related to physiological reactivity when you're trying to solve a conflict, a major conflict with your current romantic partner in adulthood? And one of the markers of physiological distress is skin conductance, which is basically how much do you sweat when you're in a situation compared to baseline, right? So we brought our targets in with their current romantic partner at some point between about 21 or 22 and 32, approximately. And we had them do a typical John Gottman type conflict resolution task. And we videotaped them while they and their partner were hooked up to skin conductance monitors, basically. And then we had them do this videotape 10-minute conflict resolution. Again, the goal of this was not to just continue to fight. The goal was to try to identify the problem and try to resolve it by talking about it with the partner over a 10-minute period of time. It's a standard procedure used in clinical psychology, especially with distressed married couples. And what we found basically is that our participants in the study, of course, their partner was not in the study, because right, you don't necessarily start dating someone who was in a study that started 30 years ago. Our participants who received poor care, rated by observers from these videotapes, sweated more relative to baseline when discussing a major problem. They were more distressed. And what's interesting is that we then went in and we started to control for some things to see if some of these potential confounds that could explain this link actually were explaining the link. And so we controlled for statistically how well the discussion went. The effect was still there. We controlled for how good of a relationship they thought they had with their partner. The effect was still there. We controlled for gender, their ethnicity, how much education they received, their childhood SES. And the correlation of -33 there, it went up and down a little bit as we partialed each of these things out, but it never became insignificant or non-significant. And so this is kind of interesting. It suggests that what's going on is not just in their heads, it's in their bodies. That when they are in conflict with people, they're more aroused physiologically as well as probably cognitively, trying to deal with problems in their relationship. We thought this was quite interesting, but we were more interested at this point in thinking about, in thinking about kind of going back and thinking about what are kind of like what's going on in the head, and what are some of the kind of mediating kinds of mechanisms that may link early care with physical health, cardiometabolic health at age 32 or age 37. And so the next thing that we did was we did a study where we where we looked, we had our composite early care index. And again, the early care index is not one interaction with the mother rated in terms of the maternal sensitivity. It's 5 interactions aggregated and added together. So it's a composite of 5 different points in time where we have these videotaped interactions. And they do tend to, by the way, correlate positively together. And so we knew that better early care was linked to lower cardiometabolic load, so to speak. In other words, early care is linked to better health outcomes. But we wanted to see whether or not their representations of their early relationship with their primary caregivers, including their mother, mediated the link. So the AI is about an hour-long interview that you take as an adult, and it asks you to reflect on your childhood. What was your childhood like from about age 5, when you could remember the first interactions with people, approximately, to about age 12? And it asks a series of questions about, how do you view your parents? What happened when you got hurt, or you were ill, or you were afraid? And it's an interview that is coded based upon how people represent and reflect on their memories, their representations of what happened to them. Secure people, typically in this interview, have a kind of a balanced view of what happened. There were good things, there were bad things. But what they typically do is they have kind of compartmentalized and made sense of what happened. They've forgiven people for their transgressions, and they have a positive view, basically, of everything being considered, of how they were treated as kids. And oftentimes, when they were ill or distressed or upset, their primary caregivers were good at coming to them like a parent in the strange situation, calming them down, soothing them, scaffolding them, and allowing them to kind of resume their life and let the negativity that's happening at a given time go. Insecure people usually either are angry in these adult attachment interviews, they're still mad at what happened in their childhood, they haven't let it go, or they're dismissive. They just say, it doesn't make a difference, even though I got knocked around by my dad or my mom or treated badly, I don't care, I'm fine now. Obviously, they're probably not fine, but that's their story, at least. And so what we found in this study, if this all makes sense, is that there was a strong link between the quality of care that our targets or participants got when they were young children and their AI representation. So if you had got better care based upon these video ratings, you were more likely to be secure in terms of your representations at age 19 and age 26. And we had 2 AIs. And if you were more secure at 26, you had lower cardiometabolic problems or fewer at age 32 and 37. And there was an indirect significant effect there from early care through AAI security to the cardiometabolic health measure that we have. So this was kind of cool because this is one of the first studies, I think it might have been the first study ever to link these three things in kind of a sequence. And again, because these measures were taken at different points in time, longitudinally and prospectively, mediation tests are a bit more appropriate because you do have these time lags here, and you have theoretically relevant measures that are pretty good measures, I think at least, of both early care representations of your childhood later on, and then after that, health outcomes. Okay. So then we wanted to get a little bit more in the weeds with our next paper. In our next paper, which also appeared in Health Psychology, led by Ali Farrell, dealt with two questions. When during life is the stress that you or your primary caregiver is exposed to most predictive of your health problems in your 30s? Is it early on? Is it kind of like more in later childhood, adolescence? Is it only in adulthood? Can we kind of look at when stress occurred during your life and how these different periods may contribute to your health? And also, does receiving better care early from your primary caregiver from these caregiving videos that we had reduce the negative effects of life stress on health? Because for some people, they can't easily avert life stress because they're poor or they don't have resources or bad things happen to them that are uncontrollable, but which is kind of depressing. But is it the case that if you have a really good sensitive caregiver, especially early in life, can that buffer or protect you from the negative impact of stress on your later health? And we were very interested in that question. It's called the maternal buffering hypothesis, and we've got data to address that. So in our study, we have these life stress interviews at each of the points in time listed right here, starting at 12 months when the participants, our targets, were 12 months old, and extending out to age 32, actually beyond that now. And at age 32, we had our outcomes, our primary outcomes, their overall ratings of health by them, their BMI, the number of diagnosed medical disorders that they had, and about 40% of the sample by age 32 had at least one or more diagnosed problems, diagnosed by physicians, basically. And then what we did, following the developmental literature, is we partitioned the timeline into different developmental periods. So early childhood typically is defined as approximately the first 5 years of life within reason. Middle childhood is basically the elementary school years, from about kindergarten or first grade, at least in the US, until about 5th or 6th grade, approximately. Adolescence is from about age 13, 12, 13 to about age 19, approximately. Young adulthood is from about 19 on to about 27, 28, approximately, when the brain fully develops. And then after that, you're into more beginnings of more middle adulthood. And so we had all of these measures, and so we could chop things up and take a look at each of these periods and try to figure out whether or not some periods were more diagnostic of eventual health problems than others. So what I'm going to show you here is a bunch of very, they're actually fairly simple findings, but graphically they're a little bit hard to decipher the first time you look at them, so I'll talk you through them. So what we found basically is this. There were significant correlations between each stress period: early childhood stress, adolescent stress, and current stress, and their health outcomes at 32. So if you had higher levels of stress at each of these periods, there was a correlation there, a significant correlation. However, there were some interesting interactions, and unfortunately, the circles aren't mapping onto what doesn't on my screen, but I'll explain here what those circles mean. Those circles should actually be on lines. So if you look at the left side, what you see is our results for BMI. On the y-axis, you have, on the left side, you have the target's potential BMI ranging from 31, which is obese, clearly obese, down to 23, which is underweight. And what you have on the slide right there, the dark red lines are those people who had high stress in adolescence. And on the x-axis on the bottom, you have their level of stress in childhood, with low stress toward the left and high childhood stress toward the right. And so what you find is that, as you might expect, when you have both high early childhood stress and high adolescent stress, you have the highest BMI. That red circle there should be on that red line, basically. I wanted to highlight that. No surprise. Stress in 2 periods of time, there's an interaction, you're heavy. You're the heaviest. Also, in terms of what's on the right, your overall health. This kind of parallels the BMI finding. So if you have high early childhood stress and you had stress also as an adolescent, that combination predicts the lowest overall health rating scores, with a mean around 2.9 on a 5-point scale. So this scale, this overall health rating scale, is a simple scale, and it works actually quite well. The question is, that they're asked is, relative to your peers, your same age peers, how healthy do you think you are? 1's poor, 3 is kind of average, and 5 is I'm excellent. My health is excellent. And so you can see that the folks there on that red line on the right that's going down view themselves as being definitely below their peers. Okay, we also found a couple of other things that are really illuminating, and I will talk you through these as well. We found a 3-way interaction, and actually, we actually predicted this a priori. This was a pre-registered basically idea that we had, and it's called the maternal buffering hypothesis. So what we found basically is this: if you look at the left panel, those are the people who had less stress during adolescence. And on the bottom there, on the x-axis, you have those individuals, participants who had low early childhood stress and high stress. And so what you find basically, we're looking here now on the y-axis, our dependent measure, is the number of diagnosed medical problems. And 0 means they didn't have any diagnosed, and larger numbers means they were closer to having at least one. In our sample, 40% had at least one diagnosed problem. There were a few that had many, but usually it was like 1. And so 0.7 means that you had 0.7 of a problem, basically, in this kind of framework, regression framework. And so what you find is that when adolescent stress is low and maternal support, the red line there, we're looking at the green circle, is high, you have fewer problems, which you would expect. Also, as you would expect, when you have high early stress and you have high adolescent stress, and your maternal support is low, that red circle, you don't do well. You report a lot of problems. But look at the right-hand side red line. This is the maternal buffering line. So those people in the sample who had high early stress and high stress during the teenage years, but had high maternal support, reported fewer problems. In fact, they reported as few problems as anyone in the sample. And this is basically evidence of maternal buffering, which we were very excited to see. And we've seen this, by the way, in other samples with other studies. The trick is, though, you have to have really, really good measures of maternal sensitivity. And sometimes self-reports, especially from the targets themselves, don't work that well because they're filtering their perception of what happened to them through other events that have happened to them. And sometimes their memory of childhood is not what actually happened in childhood. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to distinguish between actual observations of people in these situations, rated by independent people who are trained and know what different people look like, versus retrospective self-reports. Not to say that retrospective self-reports are not valuable. They can be. It's just that they're not the same thing as actual behavioral observations done during the developmental period. The last study I want to talk about real briefly is one that we've focusing more now on abuse and neglect in childhood. Our sample was a rough and tumble sample. It was born below the poverty level. 50% of our people were either neglected or abused in some way, shape, or form, not just based upon their reports, but based upon social service reports, social worker reports, police reports. And we have good measures of when the abuse occurred, who was the perpetrator, and what type of abuse it was. So in this study, basically what we did, this is the first study to look at this, we simply created a dichotomous measure of abuse. Did it happen or neglect? Did abuse happen? Yes or no? And we looked at sexual abuse, physical abuse, and then physical and cognitive neglect, and using standard Centers of Disease Control definitions of what abuse is and what neglect is. And then at age 37, we had their self-reported health quality, the number of problems they reported having, and their cardiometabolic functioning. Again, that's that 4-item composite of BMI, waist to hip ratio, blood pressure, and CRP, C-reactive protein inflammation actually in the blood from blood samples. What we found was interesting. We found that only neglect predicted health outcomes. Neglect during childhood. Abuse did not, in our sample at least, did not correlate with later health outcomes. You can see the zero order point by serial correlations right here. So whether or not you were neglected, coded 1 or 0 in childhood, basically, sometime during childhood, between 0 and 17, correlated -27 with self-reported health, 19 with having more health problems, and 20 with worse cardiometabolic functioning. And we controlled for a bunch of things, and the effect was still there. Again, the idea here is we're trying to pin it down to what was happening in childhood and try to remove some of the variance associated with what's happening now at the point in time where we're taking the health measures, if that makes sense. And we can talk a little bit about why neglect is more damaging to your health than, let's say, abuse. We had some speculations about this and a really lively interchange with, lively is a good word, with the editor because we didn't anticipate this. And we were asked to try to explain, what was going on there. And we can talk more about that in a few minutes here at the end of the talk. So in summary, what we find from this series of studies is that, and again, keep in mind, it's one sample, and it's not a huge sample, but it's got really, really good measures at the right points in time, done the right way, created by true developmental psychologists, which I'm not actually. I study social development, but I'm not a developmental psychologist. So we were able to take advantage of the brains of people like Alan Srofe and Byron England and Andy Collins, who really, when they started this project, knew exactly what to measure in an age-appropriate way with really, really good measures. And so we're grateful for that. But in summary, both the quality of caregiving and the amount of stress experienced appear to have some pretty important effects on health that may be above and beyond what's currently going on in a person's life. And this is, I think, the good news. There are cost-effective ways to intervene and improve the quality of childcare early in life. I mean, think about it for a second. Governments, even though they may want to, it's a huge task to lift people totally out of poverty. And you probably couldn't do it in the lifetime of one generation, even if we had all the money in the world. We should try to do that, but it's not necessarily logically feasible, financially or otherwise. But what we can do is we can train people when they become parents to be more sensitive, to scaffold their children, to soothe their kids, to provide them with techniques and strategies for ways to cope. And it appears from our data and from other data sets that if you do that, you can kind of take away some of the negative impact of unavoidable life stress and things like this. So in conclusion, I want to thank the many collaborators over the years. There have been dozens of people involved with the Minnesota project. We've had grants from NIA, we've had grants from NICHD. It's taken literally about 12 to 15 million US dollars, probably more than that, to keep this project running over the last 40 years. We just got another grant to look recently, well, I'm very excited about this, to go into their brains and do some scanning of their brains, and then link what's going on in terms of brain functioning in relation to what happened to them when they were young, the quality of care, the stress, et cetera. We just got that grant a couple of months ago. It's going to be a 5-year grant where we're going to bring them in to the scanner using some standard protocols in the scanner. But anyway, let me stop there. Here finally is a list. I can share these slides with the coordinators of the talk here. These are the 5 studies that I talked about, and they're the places where they're published. And I think I'll stop there and field some questions. Thank you.
This was a great talk. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for being here with us today. And before I let other people ask questions, I wanted to go back to one of the slides that you showed us about that 3-way interaction of the maternal buffering effect.
Okay, can I do that?
I don't know. Perhaps what. Because,
okay, I go now I can't do it. So there we go.
All right, that's great.
There we go. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Okay, so there is also one group here that had low adolescent stress but high early stress and high early childhood stress. And here, do I understand it correctly that people who had, even if people had high maternal support, they still ended up quite badly, right, in terms of their
so you're looking at
outcomes,
the red line on the left side, the top part of it, right? Yeah. You know, I'm not sure what your experience is, but whenever you find an interaction, there's usually 1 or 2 kind of cells that kind of reviewers.
Why? What happened there?
We really don't know. And that's a good question, because part of that interaction effect is being probably driven by the upper part of that line and not just the lower part of that line. So what you're pointing out is a very legitimate thing. High early stress, low adolescent stress, high maternal support, they are reporting more health problems later on. I'm not sure I have a good explanation, to be perfectly honest, for what's going on with that part of the equation.
Could be that maybe that was some kind of a specific sample. So people who had really, serious problem in the early childhood, and then despite the support that they received and, low stress environment that they were kept in afterwards, they still had these problems that resulted from those
it could be a
more severe experiences.
Could be a lingering thing. It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things that we do have, when they were 13, they came in and did a problem-solving task with their parent. And again, it was the same maternal. The reason why it was mothers, by the way, is that back in the 70s when this started in this sample, the mothers were always the parent. The dads were kind of sometimes there, sometimes not. And dads just didn't participate nearly as much in studies back then as they do now. And a lot of the dads in the sample basically were in and out or never in the lives of our target participants, unfortunately. And we wanted to keep the caregivers consistent. And so they weren't always birth mothers. Sometimes they were grandmothers who were the primary caregivers, but they were always primary caregivers. And so, it could very well be that maybe if you had an individual had early childhood stress that was really bad, things got better in adolescence, but they were kind of carrying forward some of those issues. And even though they had high maternal support, maybe they were just so overwhelmed by what was happening, or what did happen early on, that it did kind of get under the skin and affect their health. or it could be that that's just kind of a spurious part of, a spurious effect. We just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And do you also follow the children of these people who are included in your sample, or you stop at this generation?
Well, we here, that's a good question. We have done a little bit of following. So what we did do, it's very expensive and time consuming to do this. What we did do is when they had their first child, our participants, we brought them in and had their child do the strange situation with them. And do also some of the early maternal tasks that they did when they were 3 or 4. And so we do have measures of the quality of parenting that they gave to their kids in relation to how they were treated when they were a child by their mother, the grandmother of their kids, right? But we don't have any more measures on the children of our targets than early in life in these kind of caregiving situations. We were never able to get the grant money to be able to follow their kids, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And still, that's very useful material. Oh,
and one of the things we do,
because I see that.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I tend to have some internet problems here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any questions. I could talk a little bit about. Go ahead.
I see. If I could, I just read a question because I don't know. Maybe it's like it's only me that sees them. So, Michał asked, "Are there any interventions designed for adults who might be at risk of health issues related to their early stress? Do they need any specific support?"
That's a very good question. Surprisingly, there are not a lot, or nearly as many as you would anticipate. I think part of the reason is that, and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but the health field has been very non-prospective. In other words, they've focused on who's in front of them, what their problems are, and how to fix their health problems. The field typically does not take a longitudinal developmental perspective on health. They acknowledge it. Miller and Chin have developed a model of it, and it's being studied more, but we've not gotten to the point where there are a large number of interventions. There are some attachment interventions, and in fact, many of them have been developed in Europe that are designed to improve parenting sensitivity to kids, especially among people who are at risk for having parenting problems. And, so teaching people to be more sensitive, attuned to cues, understanding developmentally what a child can do or understand at a given age, which is something that, you would think we would teach that to people in school. We don't. It's one of the great ironies is that parenting, which is one of the most important things we do, we get minimal education. We may do a Lamaze class. There may be an occasional therapeutic intervention, but the assumption almost is you were parented. You can probably figure out how to do it. You can talk to your parents. You can talk to your friends. Kind of a strange way to think about such an important thing, right? So there are some interventions out there that could be used, but they're not necessarily targeted to the parents of kids who don't have health problems yet because they're too young, if that makes sense. But that's an important agenda for the future, is to think about how we can intervene and, deal with what we can deal with financially and otherwise. And that's an important thing for people to, I think, focus on in the future.
Thank you. Is there any other question from our audience? I believe some people are, it's our Polish thing, but we're always afraid to ask in English.
Well, what we have to talk about is that neglect finding, because that was interesting. We think, why does neglect predict health more than abuse? And we think it has to do in part with the chronicity of neglect. Oftentimes, abuse can happen multiple times by the same person or by other people. And it's very traumatic and it's very, very bad. But it's a little bit different than neglect, because neglect, one part of the definition of neglect is it not only happens once, but it's persistent. A child is not paid attention to. They are not taken care of. They are not given the right kind of, nutrition or the right kind of supervision. And we think that just the sheer chronicity of neglect compared to abuse, which is probably more temporal, may be what makes it more damaging, because it lasts longer. And we're not the only study to find this, actually. But part of the effect may depend on how severe the neglect is and what kind of neglect it is. And this is not to suggest that physical or sexual abuse is not traumatic, and in many cases, it still may have pernicious effects for your later health. It's just that in our sample, the way we were able to measure it, neglect appears to be a stronger predictor than abuse.
Yeah, especially that you focused on like biological factors. So neglect probably, as you say, relates to early childhood nutrition and, developmental possibilities, right?
Right.
Could be that other problems are more damaging psychologically.
And that's exactly what we find. Yeah, we find that we've got good measures of psychopathology, both internalizing and externalizing disorders. And what you find is that the people who have been maltreated, either neglected or abused, do have a worse psychological profile. But you're right. In terms of physical outcomes, at least in the 30s, neglect trumps abuse.
Yeah, but it's fascinating and so scary in a way. Me as a mother of young children, I really feel inspired by your research to have a good care of my children and encourage others to do the same.
It's really important. Another thing that we've learned over the years is that kids are pretty resilient, and no parent's going to be perfectly sensitive and attentive at every point in time. But what's important is you're sensitive at the right time, at the critical time. And there aren't that many situations in the lives of most of us that are really critical. Like a strange situation where you're 1 year old, you don't have a conception of the future, and all of a sudden a stranger's in the room with you and your mom has left. That's terrifying, probably, for a lot of kids. Everyone cries when they're 1 and they do that. Everyone. They go to the door, they're worried. If you're secure, you're insecure, you're disorganized, you go to the door. But the good news is, I think, is that when there's some situations that are really critical, and as long as you are attentive and supportive in those situations, it probably will all be fine.
So that's a very, very good conclusion, and let's hope that people will use your advice in their own families. So thank you very much. I believe that there are no further questions, or maybe that's my internet connection. So please, if anyone had a question that I wasn't able to receive and read, you can contact Jeff directly or email me. I would also welcome any interested and motivated young scholars in our team. So if you're looking for a nice project to join, then you're most welcome to contact us as well. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It was really a pleasure to have you today here.
I'm delighted to talk about this stuff. And again, you're doing great work there. And I look forward to our future collaborations.
I do too. Thank you.